Well, and the next project is going to be to add this 610 test panel to this Model 650 BK610 tester. I previously had done a series of videos on the restoration of the 650, and I acquired this 610 on eBay. Actually, I had to buy a whole 650. It was a pretty trashed unit, but it was cheaper than buying a 610, believe it or not. Apparently, people who sell the 610 understand that it's a nice addition, whereas people who are selling old junked 650s that include a 610 panel are willing to price them actually lower than the 610 itself. So except for having to pay a little extra for shipping, I actually got a pretty good bargain here, and only for a few dollars got this 610 test panel. So now I'm going to install it, and the instructions for doing this are all in the B&K 610 manual. I'll show you that in just a minute, but mainly the way it works is there is an octal socket that comes out the side here and is supposed to plug into socket 41 here, but you have to wire up socket 41, so that's one of the things I'll be doing. A little later, I'm going to also look at the possibility of maybe using an octal socket and putting it down there. The reason is that this method is hard to close the lid with this in there. So let's get on with that. This is a picture of the 610 panel installed in a B&K 650. This is in a book that I bought from Tube Sound, and the 610 installation instructions start right there, but they mainly consist of this little chart up there, which is connecting up socket 41. Well, socket 41 is right over there. So to get to it, I'm going to have to remove this panel. So I took the screws out all the way around, and then I'll be flipping this panel over on top of this panel, and I'll put a towel in there to buffer the two so there's no scratching. And then I'll wire up socket 41 according to the instructions in this manual. Well, here's the panel turned up on its face, and the connector back here is what in this diagram is shown here, and then there are these wiring connections for the 610 that come off of here according to this chart. But a couple of people have commented that sometimes I don't show very much in the way of technique when I'm doing all of this. So I'll try to add a little more detail in kind of the mechanical parts of what I'm doing. What I'm going to be doing is wiring this socket 41. Now you may notice I've written the socket numbers over here so I can find them easily, and also on the other side. So this is 41, socket 42, and I'm going to be running from pin 1 of socket 41 to pin 5 of socket 42. Now the directions say pin 5 of socket 43, but if you look at the schematic, you discover that 42 and 43, pin 5 is connected on both. And the reason I'm using 42 is because it's closer. So the wire will be shorter from here to here. Now before I actually work on any of these or solder on any of these, because they're pretty old, they're kind of oxidized. So I'm using a wire brush I got at Ace Hardware, and I brush off all the oxidation just so I get a better solder joint. Now the flux will cut through that oxidation to some extent, but the thicker it is, the harder it is. So my first wire that I'm going to add is this blue wire. I'm trying to preserve the color code between pin 1 of this and pin 5 of 42, which is here. So I'm going to put the camera down so I can do all of that, and I think when I get back I'll try to have finished all 8 of the pins that I need to connect up. Just a very quick insert here. I've decided to make it a little easier to work on this panel to go ahead and remove it, and once it's sitting like this, it's very easy to remove. All you have to do is unplug this cable connector that hooks it to the other panel, and then this panel becomes completely free except for the line cord, which goes in through this panel. So I'm going to remove this and lay it down so I can work on it without having the rest of this in the way. Well, I'm making steady progress. I have wired up the socket for the 610 panel, and I've inserted the octal plug that connects it. Now I haven't done the mechanical mounting of this yet, but what I want to do now is make sure that nothing I've done so far has caused any problems, and that to the extent I can test it, that the 610 panel electrically works. So the first thing I'm going to do is test a known good tube in this panel. In this case it's a 6SA7. Then I'll do the same thing for this panel using a 6SN7 because it uses one of these sockets. And finally I'll set one up on the 610 which uses this octal socket. And that'll at least give me some confidence. So I've set this up, 6SA7. The filament is set at 6. And the sensitivity is supposed to be 97. I'm going to set it to about 95 to start with. Turn the power on. And by the way, I always use one of these little things when I'm not using the 57, the Powerite, or the Tenma variable transformer, because this tells me how much current is being drawn. And you can see it's 0.21 amps, now it's 0.19. And I'm going to let this tube warm up a little bit. You notice that there are no shorts indicated, and there's no grid leakage. And remember, the meter will indicate if there's grid emission. It'll come up out of that green area. I hope you've seen the 650 restoration series that I did, because it talks a lot more about how this tester works and what these various switches and lights mean. But it's in the short grid emission position and everything passes there. So I'm going to go to test 1 and then go up to 97. And as you can see, the tube tests good. So the next thing I'm going, which it should of course, since we know it's a good tube, or at least I've tested it on other testers. So now I'm going to set up to check that 6SN7 on this panel over here to make sure that this panel is still working, and then we'll do the 610. Alright, I've set up for the 6SN7. That's this tube right there. And if you look at the numbers, it says it should be 80 and 80. This is a twin triode. So we'll set this to about 80. Sensitivity control. 6 volts on the filament. Testing for shorts and grid emission. No shorts. no grid emission. Test 1. This will be the first triode. Looks good, reads about 5,000, a little under 5,000. Test 2 reads about 4,500. So, of course, what that tells you is that these two sections are not precisely balanced. But I'll just digress for a moment to say one of the reasons that I like the 650, even though it's one of the older tube testers, is that it tests pretty much all of the tubes that can be tested for mutual conductance. It tests them for mutual conductance. You may remember, if you saw my 700 or 707 restoration series, that after the 650, B&K went to a system in which they had a panel like this, but it only tested emission. And so the basic tubes that the tester tested on what they call the DynaQuick panel or the DynaJet panel would test mutual conductance if they were a triode or a pentode or whatever. But if you went to the what I would call the overflow panel for the tubes that weren't wired up on permanent sockets, then you could only test emission. Well, the nice thing about the 650 is it tests everything that can be tested for mutual conductance. And that's important when you're doing things like balancing tubes in an amplifier, because if you don't have balanced tubes, like in a stereo amplifier, you won't get equal gain. You also won't get equal distortion or frequency response, and so on. So, in many respects, even though this is an older tester, it's a better tester than the 700 series to the extent that it tests pretty much all the tubes that can be tested for mutual conductance with a mutual conductance test. Okay, well, enough reminiscing, and let's move on then to testing this tube, which works in the 610 panel. In other words, it's a tube that came out after the 650, and the 610 panel was designed to be adaptable to virtually any new tube. Okay, I've inserted the 6E87 and set everything up, but to show you how you do that, I'm going to refer to this little booklet that you could buy from B&K, at least back in the day. And by the way, there's a number of these, different editions. This is pretty much the latest edition as far as I can tell. Now, if you look at the Tube Sound Manual, they have a version of this, and it indicates that it has the same copyright year as the one I have. However, you notice here it says copyright 1962, and this one is also copyright 1962. However, this one is newer, and it has tubes in it that are not in the Tube Sound listing. So I suspect you could even buy them later than 62, but this happens to be the latest one I've got. Okay, well, I think the 6EA7 has had enough time to heat up, so let's take a look at its listings here. You'll see it says the heater is 6. Socket is 610. In other words, the socket on the 610 panel. And you may notice that the 610 only has 4 sockets. Well, 5 if you count this, the little pin for the grid cap. A 7-pin, a 9-pin, an 8-pin octal, and an 8-pin loctal. In other words, it will not test the newer compactrons and novars and duodecars and things like that. So that is a drawback. There is a panel for this called the 615 that you can get that will test those. And you look in this listing, you see it says use the TC615 panel and chart at the end of listings. That is yet another add-on panel for the B&K tester that does let you test those newer compactrons and things of that sort. So let's look up the 6EA7 here. It says 610, 67. 67, of course, is the sensitivity. And then you see a series of numbers, 70218309911. Okay, this one refers to the test position, which is that switch right here. The rest of them all refer to settings here, A, B, C, etc. So these are all set up to those numbers, and J is set to 1. That's that last thing right here, J1. And you notice it says 99. This is another shunt for the meter. So there don't appear to be any shorts. Doesn't appear to be any grid emission. Let's do test 1. And let's see, it says 67. So we'll set it to about 67. And you see it reads good. Okay, now what I'm going to do is, since you may have noticed, there are actually 2 tests for the 6EA7. There's that first line, and then the second line says you set sensitivity to 93 and you change a few of these. So let me do that, and then I'll get back to you. I've now set up the tester for the other side of the 6EA7. That is this second set of numbers. Seven, 0. This one changes from 2 to 5. That one from 1 to 4, and correspondingly across. The H setting changes to 15. The H, if you may recall, is this dial here, which is an additional meter shunt. So we go over here. Once again, no shorts, no grid emission. Go to test 1. And I think I need to set the sensitivity to 93. Okay. And that indicates that that section is also good, though marginally so. So at least it tells me that I probably have the socket connected upright for this 610. So the next thing is to mechanically mount this inside. And to do that, I have to do a few things to the tester. One thing is I have to remove this panel down here. So I've cut out a little bit of, I've cut the cover so that I can fold it back down inside. Now I'm going to have to remove this panel. Well, I took out the panel that was in here. All this is just a little false bottom that allows you to put the line cord underneath and stick a few other things. I actually found a couple of old tubes back under there when I bought this tube tester. And of course I cut out most of the cover. This is kind of vinyl-like, or not sure exactly what it is, that makes the cover. And then I mounted this down in there, It's mounted on a couple of blocks. I don't know if you can see the blocks. They're underneath those screws there. So that pretty much completes the installation of the 610. Changing to a slightly different subject, many of you may recall that I was working on this BK610, and in fact it was at the end of that video that I mentioned that I probably would want to do some work on this. But when I got this 700, I only bought it for parts and it was in pretty bad shape. Did not have a lid and did not have a handle, didn't have latches, had some bad spots, so on. Well, I've pretty much fixed that up. I built a lid for it, as you see there. Found some hinges on the internet that will slide in like that. And it makes the top removable. And finally, I mounted a handle and some hinges or some latches on the front there. Close this thing up the way it's intended to. And it's not a really good reproduction of the original because the colors don't match, and this doesn't have the same covering. This is just wood instead of that plastic like covering and so on, which I may work on at some point in the future, but for right now I'm pretty happy, especially since this was intended to be a part set to begin with and turned out to be something that I could resurrect. So just thought you might like to know about that too. That sort of closes out what I'm doing here, and maybe I can get on to doing something other than BMK tube testers now. Hope you enjoyed it. Maybe see you in another video.